The key turned in the lock with a soft click, the sound of routine, of familiarity. Yet tonight it felt different, hollow. Nate Parker stepped into the dimly lit apartment, the weight of the day pressing on his shoulders. His body ached with exhaustion, but it was nothing compared to the weariness in his soul. He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling slowly as he shut the door behind him. The scent of expensive perfume lingered in the air. Victoria's perfume. It smelled like wealth, like control, like the woman who had held him captive in his own life for far too long. She was there, lounging on the couch, perfectly poised as always. A glass of red wine dangled between her manicured fingers, the deep crimson swirling lazily. She didn't look up when he entered. Instead, her reflection smirked back at him from the polished glass coffee table. "You're late," she remarked, her voice as smooth as silk but laced with indifference. Nate hesitated for half a second before dropping his keys onto the counter. He knew better than to answer. Any excuse would be met with a scoff, a roll of those icy blue eyes, a condescending sigh that made him feel 2 inches tall. "I had a long day," he said finally, his tone measured. Victoria laughed lightly, setting her wine down. "You always have a long day, Nate. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe you should be stronger." Her gaze finally lifted to meet his, the sharpness in her eyes cutting through the space between them. "Honestly, I don't know how you'd function without me. You'd probably fall apart in a week." Nate swallowed. The words shouldn't have stung. They were nothing new. They were just another addition to the arsenal she had built over the years. Subtle, cutting, designed to erode him piece by piece. But tonight, something inside him shifted. He didn't argue, didn't defend himself, didn't beg for an ounce of respect. Instead, he simply looked at her, really looked at her, the woman he had once adored, the woman he had sacrificed so much for. And he saw the truth. She didn't love him. She loved what he represented: stability, convenience, control. And the worst part, she was certain he would never leave. Nate nodded slowly, as if confirming something only he could hear. "Maybe you're right," he murmured. Victoria smirked, taking it as surrender. "Of course I am." He didn't say another word. Instead, he turned on his heel, walked to the bedroom, and pulled an empty suitcase from the closet. It was time. Tonight she would learn just how wrong she had been. Nate didn't slam the closet door, didn't rush, didn't make a sound. He had learned the power of silence long ago. When arguing with Victoria led to nothing but exhaustion, she thrived on conflict, fed off it like a parasite. The more he fought back, the more she enjoyed it. But silence? Silence was something she had never learned to handle. So he packed quietly. The zipper of the suitcase hummed softly as he opened it. He reached for his shirts first, neatly folding them, placing them in careful stacks. His hands worked methodically, his mind eerily clear. The years of resentment, the slow erosion of his self-worth, the constant belittling, it had all been leading to this moment. A pair of his shoes sat beside the nightstand. He picked them up and set them inside the suitcase. One by one, the empty spaces where his things had been grew larger. The closet shelves, once crammed with neatly organized belongings, were now bare. The life he had built here, the one she had convinced him was impossible to leave, was vanishing with each item he packed. In the living room, he could still hear her, the occasional clink of her glass against the coffee table, the low hum of music from the speaker she always left on. She hadn't followed him, she didn't know. Not yet. His fingers hovered over his wedding ring. For a brief moment, something in him hesitated. Not out of love, not out of regret, but out of sheer disbelief at how long he had tolerated this. The man he had become, the man who had let himself be chipped away piece by piece, was a stranger to him now. He slipped the ring off and placed it on her vanity. Let her find it in the morning. Let her realize, far too late, that she had finally pushed too hard. He grabbed a sheet of paper from the drawer. One last message, one final goodbye. "You were so sure I'd stay. Now you'll know what it feels like to live without me. No anger, no long explanations, just the truth." He folded it neatly and placed it on her pillow. And then without a word, he grabbed his suitcase and walked toward the front door. The apartment feels different when you're leaving for good. Nate had left this apartment hundreds of times before, for work, for errands, for the occasional breath of fresh air when Victoria's presence became suffocating. But this was different. Everything looked colder. The walls seemed taller, more distant. The space between objects stretched unnaturally, as if the apartment itself knew what was happening. He paused near the kitchen, taking in the last traces of a life he was leaving behind. The expensive marble countertops Victoria had insisted on, the wine glasses she only used when she had company to impress, the framed pictures, mostly of her, hung strategically in places where guests would notice, not a single picture of just him, not a single photo of them together that didn't feel staged. This wasn't a home, it was a curated space, an exhibit of Victoria's carefully constructed life, and he had been nothing more than a supporting character in it. With a slow exhale, Nate reached for the doorknob, and then he heard her voice. "You're being awfully quiet tonight." His fingers stilled. She was still on the couch, still sipping her wine, still so certain that she owned every piece of him. He didn't turn around. If he spoke, she'd sense something was off. If he so much as hesitated, she'd weave her way into his mind, plant seeds of doubt like she had so many times before. He swallowed, steadied himself, and finally said, "Yeah, just tired." Victoria didn't even glance at him. "You always are." That was the last thing she ever said to him as her husband. He walked out, closing the door behind him with the gentlest click. Victoria had no idea that when she woke up the next morning, she would wake up to nothing at all. Victoria Parker never rushed in the mornings. She never had to. Her world was built for comfort, for effortless perfection. She woke when she pleased, stretched lazily in silk sheets, and padded across the cool hardwood floor to the kitchen, where she expected coffee to be made, not because she needed it, but because Nate had always made it for her. It was one of those small, invisible acts of devotion she never acknowledged. But this morning was different. As she slid out of bed, she noticed a strange stillness in the apartment. The air felt thinner, lighter. She frowned, rubbing the sleep from her eyes as she walked toward the kitchen. No coffee. Her frown deepened. Nate was always up before her, always in the kitchen by now. She sighed, annoyed. Was he sulking again? He had been quiet last night, but she hadn't thought much of it. She turned toward the bedroom, intending to call out for him, but something made her stop. Her closet door was open. It wasn't wide open, just a sliver, but enough to make her stomach clench. Victoria hated things being left ajar. Nate knew that. She strode toward it, ready to scold him for being careless, but the second she pulled the door fully open, the words died in her throat. It was empty, completely, utterly empty. The shelves were bare, the hangers swung slightly from where something had recently been removed, and the space where Nate's shoes had been was now just a shadow on the floor. Her breath hitched. She turned, scanning the room. His nightstand was clear. His watch, his favorite watch, was gone. His leather jacket, the one she had always rolled her eyes at but secretly loved on him, wasn't draped over the chair. A cold sensation crept over her skin, tightening around her ribs. This wasn't real. This wasn't happening. Her gaze snapped to the bed, and that's when she saw it. A single sheet of paper folded neatly on her pillow. She reached for it with fingers that felt strangely disconnected from the rest of her body, her mind already rejecting what was about to happen. "You were so sure I'd stay. Now you'll know what it feels like to live without me." The breath she had been holding came out in a sharp exhale. She stared at the words, read them again, and again. Her lips parted as if to form a denial, but no sound came out. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, opening drawers, checking the bathroom, pulling open the front closet, nothing. No suitcase, no duffel bag, no lingering scent of his cologne in the air. Gone. The word echoed in her mind, colliding against every assumption she had ever made about him. Nate had always been there. No matter how cold she was, no matter how cruel, he had always stayed. He was predictable, reliable, easy to manipulate. He was supposed to be incapable of leaving. Yet here she stood, alone, in a hollow apartment. Her hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She scrolled to his name, her thumb hovering over the call button. But something made her pause. Would he even pick up? A cold shiver ran down her spine. She tapped the call button. It rang once, twice, then voicemail. She pulled the phone away, staring at the screen. She called again, straight to voicemail this time. Her heart pounded against her ribs, her breath coming faster. No, this wasn't right. He was just playing a game, a pathetic attempt to get her attention. Her fingers flew over the screen as she typed, "Victoria, cute stunt. When you're done sulking, come home." She watched the screen, expecting the three little dots to appear, signaling that he was typing back. Enough. She tossed the phone onto the couch and stormed to the kitchen. grabbing the coffee beans with far more force than necessary. He would be back. He had to come back. She scoffed under her breath. He was probably at some cheap motel waiting for her to apologize. That's what this was. A stunt. A desperate attempt to prove he had power. But hours passed. Afternoon bled into evening, and he still didn't respond. The realization crept in slowly like a draft through a cracked window, quiet but undeniable. He wasn't coming back. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she paced the apartment, stopping now and then to check her phone. Still no messages, no calls. Her mind raced, grasping for explanations. Maybe he had gone to live. That woman had always been in his ear, whispering poison. Maybe she had convinced him to pull this little act. A spark of fury ignited in her chest. She pulled up Liv's number and pressed call. It rang and rang. Then, click. Victoria's grip tightened on the phone. Where is he? A pause. Then, in that infuriatingly calm voice, Liv said, I was wondering when you'd call. Victoria clenched her jaw. Listen to me, you meddling little... He left Victoria. The bluntness of it caught her off guard. Liv sighed, the sound filled with something that sent a new kind of dread down Victoria's spine. You should have seen this coming, Liv continued. You should have known there was a limit to how much a person can take. Victoria's throat tightened. You don't know anything about us. I know enough, Liv countered. I know he spent years breaking himself just to keep you happy. I know he thought he wasn't strong enough to leave, and I know that last night, something changed. Victoria swallowed hard. I don't know where he is, Liv added, and even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. The line went dead. Victoria slowly lowered the phone, her hand trembling. For the first time, real fear slithered into her chest. Nate was gone, and for the first time in her life, Victoria Parker had no idea what to do. Victoria Parker had never known what true silence felt like until now. The apartment, once a reflection of her curated life, now felt cavernous. The minimalist gray tones, the carefully arranged furniture, the spotless kitchen, everything that once seemed elegant now felt empty, meaningless. There was no sound of Nate moving in the next room, no faint rustling of papers as he worked late into the night, no creak of the floorboards where he always stood making coffee in the mornings. She was alone, and she felt it. Victoria sat on the edge of the couch, phone clutched in her hand, willing it to ring. But there was nothing. Her text messages remained unread. Her calls went straight to voicemail. She had spent hours trying to find him. She had driven past his office only to be told he had taken an indefinite leave. She had even called his sister, whom she despised, only to receive a clipped, "He doesn't want to talk to you, Victoria," before the call was cut off. And Liv, that self-righteous, interfering, pathetic woman. Victoria's jaw clenched at the memory of their conversation. She had never felt powerless in her life, not even when she was younger, struggling to make a name for herself. But now, with each passing hour, with each unanswered message, the power she had always held over Nate seemed to dissolve, slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. He was supposed to come crawling back, ashamed of his little tantrum. He was supposed to need her. Instead, he had vanished. Victoria exhaled sharply and pushed herself up from the couch. Fine. If Nate thought he could walk away from her, from this, then he had another thing coming. The hunt begins. Victoria wasn't the kind of woman to wait. She took action. By midday, she had hired a private investigator. She wasn't looking for closure. She didn't believe in such things. No, she wanted information. She wanted to know where Nate had gone, who he was with, and what exactly had made him think he could escape her. She sat stiffly in the sleek leather chair of the investigator's office, tapping her manicured nails against the desk as he scanned the details she had provided. How long has he been gone? The investigator asked, glancing up. 48 hours, she said through gritted teeth. The man raised an eyebrow. And you're already hiring someone to find him? Victoria tilted her chin up. He's my husband, was, the investigator muttered under his breath. She ignored the remark. What can you tell me? She pressed. The investigator leaned back in his chair. Well, Parker isn't exactly covering his tracks. He withdrew a large sum of money from your joint account the night he left, but he's not using credit cards, which means he doesn't want to be traced. That suggests he's either staying with someone or planning to be off the grid for a while. Victoria's fingers tightened against her palm. Where? The investigator flipped through a few papers. He's been spotted once, Security footage from an ATM near a small residential area downtown. That's all I have so far. Downtown, Victoria scoffed. How typical. If Nate was trying to start over, he had chosen the most predictable, uninspired place to do it. She stood abruptly. Find out exactly where he's staying, the investigator smirked. You want to bring him back home or just confront him? Victoria smiled tightly. That's none of your concern. The confrontation. It took less than a day for her to get an address. She arrived outside the building just after sunset, her black Mercedes humming softly as she idled at the curb. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't desperation. This wasn't about losing. This was about reminding Nate of who she was, who they were. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the pavement as she approached the modest brick apartment building. It was laughable, really. After all the years they had spent in their sleek, luxurious home, this was where he had chosen to run. She didn't bother knocking. She knew him. He never locked doors. The handle turned and she stepped inside. The apartment was quiet. The air smelled of fresh paint and new beginnings. And then she saw him. Nate was sitting on the couch, his back to her, his posture relaxed in a way she hadn't seen in years. Across from him, Liv sat, laughing at something he had just said. Victoria's stomach twisted. He hadn't just left. He had moved on. The rage simmering beneath her skin exploded. Unbelievable, she spat. Both Nate and Liv turned. For a second, there was silence. Nate's expression didn't shift. No surprise, no regret. Just calm, steady, free. Liv, on the other hand, raised an eyebrow, sipping from her tea like she had been expecting this. Victoria, Nate said simply. She crossed her arms. So this is it? This is where you run to after all these years? Nate exhaled. I didn't run, Victoria. I left. A cold laugh escaped her lips. And you think this is better? She gestured to the apartment. This pathetic low-rent existence? He didn't react. Didn't argue. That infuriated her more. I deserve an explanation, she snapped. Nate studied her for a long moment before finally speaking. No, you don't. The word sliced through her like a blade. For years, he had accepted her cruelty, absorbed every insult, every manipulation. But this? This was different. He wasn't angry. He wasn't hurt. It was done. Victoria felt her throat tighten. So that's it? That's it, he confirmed. She clenched her fists, turning on her heel before she could betray the raw ache curling inside her chest. She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. But even as she got into her car, her pulse hammering, she knew this wasn't over. It was never over. Victoria Parker had never been the kind of woman to accept defeat. As she drove away from the modest apartment where Nate had so easily dismissed her, rage pulsed through her veins, hot and uncontrollable. He had left her. He had walked away from her, the woman who had shaped him, molded him, made him into something presentable, something valuable. And now, just because he had found some fleeting sense of strength, he thought he could erase her from his life? No, that wasn't how this works. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her perfectly manicured nails pressing into her palm. Nate had always been predictable. She had spent years learning his weaknesses, controlling the pace of their life together, ensuring that no matter how much he thought about leaving, he never truly would. But she had miscalculated. She had underestimated just how much he had changed. Days of silence. Victoria expected him to reach out. At first, she convinced herself that he needed time. He was stubborn, but stubbornness faded. He would come to his senses, realize what he had thrown away. But the days stretched into a week, then two. Not a single call. Not a single text. The silence became unbearable. She buried herself in distractions, shopping, brunches, expensive salon appointments. But nothing filled the gnawing void inside her. She told herself it was anger that kept her up at night, that it wasn't loss, that she didn't actually miss him. But the truth slithered in, cold and merciless. Nate was gone, and this time, she couldn't manipulate him back. The final encounter. 3 weeks after he left, she saw him again. It was by accident, or maybe fate had chosen this as her punishment. She had been walking into her favorite cafe, the same place where Nate had once waited for her, always arriving early to get her preferred table. But now, as she pushed open the glass door, the air inside was different. And then she saw him. He was sitting by the window, laughing, and he wasn't alone. Liv sat across from him, leaning in slightly, her eyes warm, her body language effortless. And Nate, He looked lighter. The weight she had placed on him for years was gone. Victoria's breath caught in her throat. For the first time, the reality of it all hit her, not in fiery anger, but in something worse. Emptiness. She had lost him, truly lost him. Not because he hated her, not because he was seeking revenge, but because he had found something she had never allowed him to have. Peace, acceptance, or something like it. Victoria left the cafe without a word. There was nothing left to say. For all her efforts, all her plans, all her certainty that she could always pull him back, Nate had done the unthinkable. He had chosen himself over her, and as she walked back to her car, the realization settled over her like a suffocating weight. She could fight, she could scheme, she could throw all the venom in the world at him. But it wouldn't matter, because for the first time in their relationship, Nate Parker had stopped waiting for her, and that was a loss she would never recover from.